The solicitor did not look at her once the entire time he read the terms aloud. Miriam Voss stood 3 feet behind her father's chair in the back room of the print shop, close enough to smell the ink that had soaked into the floorboards for 30 years, and she listened to every word. The agreement was 17 lines long. She had already memorized it by the time the solicitor set the papers on the press table and uncapped his pen. £4,200 in trade debts, accumulated over 6 years of bad contracts and worse decisions. Her father, Clement Voss, printer of Hartmore Street, had borrowed against the equipment, the building, the good name of a business his own father had built from nothing. He had spent it on paper stock he never received, on a partner who vanished to Halifax with half the accounts, on a press that shook itself apart in 18 months. And now, in settlement of a debt owed to Alderthorpe or Consolidated, he was signing his only daughter over in marriage to a man she had never met, a man the whole of Renwick County called the Deaf Baron. The Baron of Alderthorpe had not been seen at a public assembly in 3 years. He did not attend sessions at the county court. He sent his land agent to negotiate every contract that bore his name. The servants at Alderthorpe House, according to the women at the market on Croft Street, communicated with him by written slate. He had been deaf since childhood, they said. Born that way, or made that way by fever, the story changed depending on who was telling it. What did not change was this: he had never married. He was 31 years old, and he owned half the river valley between Hartmore and the coast. Clement signed his name with a steadiness that astonished her. He did not look at her either. "You will want for nothing," he said to the wall. "He is a wealthy man." Miriam said nothing. She had not been asked to speak. She was 23 years old. She had set type for the press since she was 9. She could read a document backwards in mirror image from the compositor's plate, pull the error from a column of figures that, before the ink had dried, and translate the legal French in a court filing, without stopping to look anything up. She had done all of it because her father's hands shook by afternoon, and someone had to keep the contracts from going out with mistakes that would cost them clients they could not afford to lose. None of this had mattered to Clement Voss. She was the last asset he had not yet sold. Miriam went upstairs and sat on the edge of her cot in the compositing room, which had been her bedroom since she was 14, because her father needed the sleeping quarters for storage, and she pressed her palms flat on her knees and let herself feel the shape of what had just happened. Not grief, something older than grief, the recognition that every arrangement she had ever trusted to hold had been held together by her own hands, and that the moment she stopped holding, everything simply fell. She did not cry. Crying required a stillness she did not have time for. Her name was Miriam Voss, and she had 2 days before the carriage came. She spent them doing what she always did when she needed to think. She went through the files. The print shop kept records going back 22 years, client contracts, deposition copies, county notices, broadsheet commissions. Miriam had been the one to organise and maintain them since she was 15, because her father had filed things by colour of folder rather than any system a second person could use, and twice they had lost billable work because no one could find the original agreement. She had built a proper index. She had cross-referenced every standing client by name, service and outstanding balance. And there, between a surveyor's notice from the spring and a set of inheritance filings from a family named Colbert, she found it. A deposition transcript, 3 years old, sealed with the county court's wax and marked for the Alderthorpe file. Her father had been commissioned to print 3 official copies and had filed the compositor's proof. Miriam had indexed it without reading it because sealed court documents were not hers to read. She read it now. The deposition was from a man named Galt, a former groundskeeper at Alderthorpe House. He had witnessed an incident on the estate grounds 2.5 years prior. A quarrel, he called it, though his language for the details was careful in the way language is careful when a man has been told to be careful. The quarrel had been between the Baron and his younger brother Fenn. Galt had not heard the words because he was 40 yards away and the wind was wrong. What he had seen was his description. The younger brother striking the Baron across the side of the head with an open hand, the Baron going down on one knee, and then a second blow, this one with a closed fist, before 2 footmen came running from the house. The deposition had been taken as part of an inquiry into the Baron's sudden and complete loss of hearing, which had occurred within the same month. The inquiry had been closed. The ruling was illness. The file had been sealed by order of the magistrate. Her father had printed the copies and said nothing. Miriam sat with the deposition in her hands and felt the cold work its way up from her fingers to her chest. She had grown up around court filings. She knew the difference between a ruling made on evidence and a ruling made on instruction. She also knew that a man willing to seal this file was exactly the kind of man who would settle a debt by selling his daughter rather than by accounting for what he actually knew. She reread every word. She set it back in the folder and put the folder in her trunk. The morning the carriage came, her father was still at breakfast. She carried her own trunk to the door. The coachman was a broad, quiet man who did not offer to help and did not speak. Miriam climbed in and the door closed, and Hartmore Street disappeared behind the first turn. She had lived above that press for 23 years. The building did not pause in her leaving. The road to Alderthorpe House took 5 hours along the river valley. The landscape changed as she moved north, the close-pressed buildings of Hartmore giving way to wider fields, then to the wooded slopes of the valley proper, then to a long stretch of open land, at the edge of which Alderthorpe House sat on a low rise above the river. Its limestone face turned toward the water like a man watching for weather. It was not as large as she had imagined. It was built with a precision that felt deliberate, every window level, every line of the roofline clean. The grounds were neat without being ornate. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was decorative that could instead be sound. A woman met her at the door. Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, introduced herself with a nod that was not unfriendly and produced a small chalkboard from the pocket of her apron, which she held up briefly as though demonstrating a tool Miriam might need. "His lordship communicates through text," she said. "There are slates in every room." She paused. Some of the staff use basic gesture as well. "If you wish to learn, one of the footmen, Pell, is quite good." Miriam nodded. She did not say that she had already been thinking during the 5-hour drive about exactly this. The entrance hall was warm and absolutely silent. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of a household that had learned to be quiet because quiet was what its master needed. The servants moved without unnecessary sound. The floor had been fitted, she noticed, with thick runners along every main corridor, the kind that muted footsteps. On the wall beside the staircase, a series of small mirror panels had been mounted at intervals, angled so that a person anywhere in the lower hall could be seen from 3 different points without being directly in front of you. Someone had thought very carefully about how to live here. He was in the study. Miriam registered the room first. Orderly, book-lined, with a large desk set facing the door rather than the window, so that anyone entering could be seen immediately. Then she registered the man at the desk who had already registered her. Leighton Alderthorpe, the Baron of Alderthorpe, was not what she had assembled in her mind during 5 hours of carriage travel. He was younger than his stillness suggested, with a kind of face that had been made for expression and had learned, through some long discipline, to hold still. His hair was dark, pushed back, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the exact brown of the river in low autumn water, clear all the way down and watching everything. He rose. He did not reach for a slate. He looked at her with the unhurried attention of a man accustomed to reading information from what he could see, because he could not hear any of it, and he made a bow that was exact and brief. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and released her cleanly. He turned to the desk and wrote on the slate that had been sitting at the ready. He turned it toward her, Miss Voss. "The ceremony is arranged for 3 o'clock. I see no reason for delay." His handwriting was clear, vertical, and fast. It looked like a man who had been writing messages his entire life, rather than speaking them, because he had. Miriam looked at the words on the slate and thought of 17 things she could say, and said none of them, because she had been raised in a print shop, and she understood that some messages were worth less in response than in silence. She nodded. The ceremony was short. The chapel on the east edge of the grounds was old stone and thin light, and the only people present were Mrs. Hatch, Pell the footman, the vicar, and an elderly woman in dark green, who sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her eyes on Miriam from the moment she entered. She was introduced afterward as Lady Vane, Leighton's great-aunt on his mother's side, a woman of 70 or so who had the eyes of someone 30 years younger and the posture of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. The vicar spoke. Leighton read the words from a small card he held in his left hand. When the moment came for the ring, his attention did not drift to the card, or to the vicar, or to the general middle distance. It came to Miriam. He found her hand without fumbling. The ring settled into place with a precision that felt considered, and then his hand withdrew, and he was facing forward again. And the expression on his face was the same controlled stillness it had been since she walked in. Miriam noticed. She filed it. Lady Vane examined her over tea with the thoroughness of someone appraising a document for forgery. She asked no direct questions. She made no comments. She simply looked, and Miriam sat straight and looked back, and at the end of it Lady Vane set down her cup and said, without inflection, "You have more spine than I expected from a printer's daughter," and then she stood and left. Miriam was not sure whether that was approval. She suspected it might be the closest Lady Vane came to it. Her rooms were in the south wing. They were clean and recently aired, with a desk beneath the window that held a full writing set and 3 slates of different sizes, and a shelf of reference books along the north wall that someone had chosen with care, a surveying manual, 2 volumes of county land law, a registry of commercial contracts, a medical dictionary, a household account guide. Whoever had selected them had been thinking about a specific kind of person, someone practical, someone who would use them. She stood in the room for a long time before she sat down. She was the Baroness of Alderthorpe. The word sat in her mouth like a key that did not yet have a lock. Dinner was taken in near silence, which was not uncomfortable so much as it was simply new. The table was not so long as to be theatrical, and Leighton sat at the opposite end with a slate near his hand and ate with the same efficient precision with which he did everything else. Twice he slid a question down the table on paper, passed by Pell. The journey, was it tolerable? And then, later, are the rooms adequate? Miriam wrote her answers on paper and sent them back. Yes, the road past the valley fork is badly rutted, but the carriage was sprung. Yes, the books on the shelf are exactly what I would have chosen. He read her second answer twice. She saw him read it twice. He set the paper down, and something in his expression shifted, fine as the change in weather before rain, and then he was eating again. After dinner, Miriam walked the house, because the thought of sitting in her rooms on her wedding night in silence was less attractive than the thought of learning the shape of the place she now lived. She found him in the library at the back of the house, standing at the long table with a spread of maps under the lamplight. He had his back to the door and did not hear her enter. He was tracing a line on one of the maps with his finger, the kind of slow, concentrated movement that meant he was solving something, not studying something. She stood in the doorway long enough to understand that she was looking at a man who had learned to live entirely within himself. Not because he wanted to, because he had had to. She stepped forward. The floorboard did not creak. He did not turn. She moved to the edge of the table and picked up the slate that was lying there, and wrote on it and set it where his downward gaze would find it. I've worked with survey maps. What's the problem? He looked up from the map to the slate. Then he looked at her. The stillness on his face was absolute for one breath. Then he pulled the slate toward him, erased her words with his sleeve, and wrote his own. The northern boundary survey disagrees with the deed of grant by 40 yards. The surveyor says the tree line is the marker. The deed says the creek bed. The creek moved. Miriam looked at the map. She looked at the annotations. She picked up the chalk. When was the deed issued? 1809. Pull the water table survey from that year. If the creek was seasonal, it would have been charted differently than a permanent waterway. The deed would have specified which reading. He was still. Then he turned to the shelves and moved along them with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where everything was, and he pulled a bound volume from the third shelf without hesitating, and came back to the table and set it down between them, and opened it to the county water records for 1809. The creek, according to the survey that year, had been recorded as permanent. They worked side by side for an hour. She read the documents he could not easily track, not because he could not read, but because the volume of cross-referencing required jumping between pages in a rhythm that was easier with 2 sets of eyes. He was precise and fast when he wrote. He had a way of pointing to a line in a document and looking at her that communicated, "What do you make of this?" as clearly as any spoken question. At 10 o'clock he wrote on the slate, "You should rest. It has been a long day." She looked at the slate and then at him. His face said something his hands had not written. She could not read it yet. She was not sure he expected her to. She went upstairs and sat at the writing desk and thought about the deposition in her trunk. 2 days after the wedding, a letter arrived by courier. It was addressed to Leighton but left open on the hall table by Mrs. Hatch, who brought it to Miriam with a look that suggested someone needed to know its contents before it reached him. It was from a man who signed himself F. Alderthorpe, Fenn. The letter was 3 sentences. It informed Leighton that he intended to challenge the terms of the Alderthorpe entailment on the grounds that a man who could not hear testimony could not competently manage an estate. It referenced a prior agreement that Fenn claimed their mother had made with him before her death, giving him precedence in estate matters should Leighton be found incapacitated. It was not a request, it was a declaration. Miriam read it twice. She set it down and looked at the hall table and felt the familiar cold working through her. She knew this kind of document. She had printed versions of it, challenged the competency, claimed the prior agreement, moved the legal ground before the other side can find it. It was a technique. Someone had coached Fenn on it, or someone was pulling the letters for him. She wrote a note and asked Mrs. Hatch to bring it to Leighton in the study. "There is a letter on the hall table from your brother. I have read it. I need to speak with you before you respond." He came to the south sitting room 10 minutes later. She had the letter on the table between them and the deposition from her trunk beside it. She had not planned to show him that today. She had planned to wait, to understand the landscape better, to be certain of what she was holding. But the letter from Fenn had changed the timing. She slid the deposition toward him. He looked at the document. He looked at the county court seal. He looked at her. His expression had gone to the stone place, not the careful stillness of performance, but the genuine locked-down stillness of a person whose body has learned to hold very still when something is very bad. She picked up the chalk. "I found this in my father's files. He printed the official copies. He sealed the original by order of the magistrate. I read it before I came here. I know what it says." He wrote back, "Where did you find it?" "Our print shop files. My father kept the compositor's proof." She paused. Then she added, "He knew. He sealed it because Fenn's solicitor holds his debt. I believe Fenn told him to seal it, and I believe Fenn is now using the same approach with this entailment claim." Leighton read her words. He was motionless for long enough that she began to count the seconds without meaning to. Then he set the chalk down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the 2 documents side by side. The letter from Fenn and the deposition of a groundskeeper who had seen what he had seen. He had not spoken of it. She understood. Now why? A man who had lost his hearing 2.5 years ago to a quarrel that had been officially ruled an illness, living in a house fitted with mirror panels and thick floor runners, who had sent his land agent to every public function for 3 years. This was not a man hiding from society. This was a man keeping himself alive in a way that looked, to the outside, like eccentricity. She wrote, "He is moving because you married." A wife changes the entailment argument. "He did not expect you to marry." A long pause. "Why did you not hold this document for your own protection?" She looked at the question on the slate. It was the right question. It was the question she would have asked. She took the chalk because it is not mine to hold, and because what was done to you was wrong, and the person who helped do it was my father, and if there is a way to correct that, I am going to find it. He read the words. He looked up at her. His eyes held that same river-bottom clarity, clear and watchful and going down a long way, and for the first time since she had arrived at Alderthorpe House, the stillness on his face broke open slightly. The way ice breaks at the edge first, not in the middle, but at the place where it meets something warmer. He wrote one word, "Thank you." It was not a small thing the way he wrote it. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a collaboration. Miriam brought her knowledge of documents, and Leighton brought his knowledge of the estate's legal history. And every evening after the staff retired, they sat in the south sitting room with the record books and the correspondence files, and built the picture piece by piece. Leighton had kept every letter his brother had sent over 3 years. He had kept copies of every response he had returned. He had a solicitor in the city, a careful man named Privat, who arrived by the end of the week and spent 3 days in the East Parlour working through what they had assembled. Privat was impressed by the deposition. He was more impressed by Miriam's handwritten reconstruction of the case chronology, which she had put together from the compositor's proof, her memory of 2 other court documents she had typeset for her father's office during the same period, and a set of letters in the Alderthorpe correspondence file that she had found by working backward through Leighton's own records. "She's done half the barrister's work," Privat said, which was not intended to reach Miriam, but did through Mrs. Hatch, who had no particular policy on keeping things from the Baroness. The evenings changed. They still worked, but the work acquired a rhythm that was less like construction and more like conversation. Miriam writing observations on the slate, Leighton responding, both of them looking at the same pages until one or the other of them caught the thing the other had missed. She learned the pace of his handwriting. She learned that he wrote faster when he was certain, and slower when he was working something out. She learned that when he pressed his thumbnail against his chin while he was reading, he was going to disagree with the document when he finished it. He learned things about her too. She became aware of this gradually, the way his eyes tracked her when she was moving around the room, and then returned to the documents when she stopped, the way he twice started to write something on the slate, and then erased it before turning it toward her, the way he had set her second answer from that first dinner. "The books on the shelf are exactly what I would have chosen," face down on his own desk, which she saw when Privat needed access to the desk drawer. Lady Vane noticed everything. The great aunt moved through Alderthorpe House on a schedule known only to herself and arrived in rooms at moments that were never quite accidental. She sat with her embroidery in the East Parlour while Privat worked, and her needle moved in precise arcs while her eyes did something else entirely. One afternoon she stopped Miriam in the corridor outside the library. "He has not laughed since before the quarrel," Lady Vane said without preamble. "Yesterday he laughed. I heard it from the upper landing. You were reading him something from the county record, a comment you had written in the margin about the surveyor's arithmetic." Miriam held still. "I am not a sentimental woman," Lady Vane continued, turning the embroidery hoop in her hands. "I did not expect a printer's daughter from a distressed print shop to be equal to this house. I was incorrect." She walked away without waiting for an answer. Her heels did not click because the floor runners absorbed the sound, but her departure had its own kind of punctuation anyway. Fen Alderthorpe arrived on a Thursday in a hired carriage with a solicitor of his own, and a man Miriam did not recognise who turned out to be a physician brought to assess Leighton's competency. He was 27, younger than Leighton's 31, and he had their colouring but none of Leighton's stillness. He moved with the restless energy of someone who had been waiting for his moment for a long time and believed it had finally arrived. He swept into the entrance hall as though he owned it. Miriam was standing at the foot of the stairs. Fen stopped. He looked at her with the kind of assessment that is not about what it appears to be. "So he actually married," he said, mostly to himself. Then, louder pleasantly, "You must be the new Baroness. I understand the arrangement was rather sudden." "I understand most arrangements are," Miriam said. "Your letter arrived Tuesday. Lord Alderthorpe will receive you in the library." The library had been laid out by Privat that morning with exact care. The Alderthorpe entailment document was on the desk. Beside it was the copy of the prior agreement Fen claimed existed, which Privat had already shown to be dated 3 months after their mother's death, and witnessed by a man who could not be located by any county registry. Beside that was the deposition from Galt, the groundskeeper. Leighton was standing when they entered. He did not use a slate. He used a small card and pencil to communicate, which was his ordinary private method, and he stood at his own desk in his own house with a composure that made the physician shift uncomfortably, because there was nothing in this man's bearing that suggested incompetency of any kind. Fen moved to the desk. He picked up the entailment document with the ease of a man who has rehearsed the gesture. "I expect you've seen my letter. Given the circumstances, the sensible outcome. The prior agreement is forged." Miriam spoke before she had fully decided to. The room tipped toward her. She did not flinch. She had not raised her voice. She had simply stated it. The date is wrong. Your mother died on the 15th of March. This agreement bears a date of the 22nd. The witness, a Mr. Crane, does not appear in any county registry of solicitors, notaries, or witnesses for that year. I have typeset enough legal documents to recognise the spacing when a date has been altered by resetting the type. The descenders on the 3 and the 5 in the date are not consistent with the rest of the document. The type was reset. Fenn's solicitor said something that Miriam did not catch because she was still looking at Fenn. His face had changed, not all at once. The pleasantness slid first, then the confidence, and what was underneath was not anger, but something more informative than anger, fear. The particular fear of a person whose plan has worked for 2.5 years and has just met its first genuine obstacle. "This is absurd," he said. She is the Baroness of Alderthorpe." Leighton wrote on his card and held it up. He then turned it over and had written on the back, "And she is correct." Furthermore, Miriam moved to the desk. She placed the deposition in front of Fenn's solicitor. This is a deposition taken by the county court following an inquiry into Lord Alderthorpe's loss of hearing. The deposition was sealed by order of the magistrate. The magistrate, Gerald Voss, my father, sealed it because his debts were held by your client's solicitor. The deposition describes a physical assault that occurred on these grounds, witnessed by a member of this estate staff. She looked at Fenn directly. "Your solicitor is in possession of my father's debts. I know this because I maintained my father's accounts. I would be prepared to provide this information to the county court." The room was very still. Fenn's physician had not moved since Miriam began speaking. He stood with his bag at his side and his eyes on the documents and the expression of a man who understood that he had been brought here to perform a function that was not going to be required today. "This is not concluded," Fenn said. His voice was flat. "You cannot simply—" "We can," Leighton wrote. He set the card down. He did something then that Miriam would remember afterward, not for its drama, but for its plainness. He picked up the forged agreement and handed it to Privat, and Privat placed it in his case. And Leighton turned back to his brother with the steadiness of a man who has been waiting for 2.5 years to stand in this exact room and do exactly this, and he looked at Fenn without performing anything at all. Fenn left within the hour. His solicitor did not speak on the way out. The physician excused himself with the brevity of a man who wished not to be associated with anything he had witnessed. The hall door closed. Miriam stood in the library and let the quiet come back around her. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she addressed by pressing them flat against her thighs until they decided to behave. Privat was gathering documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who was going to have a great deal of work to do and was looking forward to it. Mrs. Hatch had appeared at some point during the last few minutes and was standing near the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time to see exactly this. She went up to her room afterward and sat on the floor with her back against the foot of the bed and let her composure come apart privately, which was her preference. The anger came first, because it always did. The fury of 2.5 years of a sealed report, and her father's complicit silence, and the particular violence of pretending an assault was an illness, so that the man who committed it could go on circling his brother's life, looking for the right moment. The relief came second, thinner and more complicated, because relief is always complicated when the problem is not fully gone, only turned. And then the third thing, the one she had not been expecting, which was not quite loneliness and not quite gratitude, but something between the two that had no name she could find in any document she had ever typeset. The knock came soft 2 times. She stood up and opened the door. Leighton stood in the corridor. He did not have a slate. He held a single card, and on it he had written 4 words. "Are you all right?" She looked at the card. She looked at him. In the low light of the corridor, his face was entirely open in a way she had not seen it before. Not even in the library over the maps, not even in the south sitting room when she showed him the deposition. The controlled surface was gone, and what was underneath was not grief, not strategy, not the careful management of a man who had taught himself to live in a world that communicated in sound he could not access. It was just him, looking at her. She took the card gently from his hand. She turned it over and wrote on the back, "Better now." She gave it back. He read it, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but in the direction of one, and it changed his whole face. She let him in. He sat in the chair by the window, and she sat at the desk, and for a while neither of them did anything that required communication at all. The lamp burned, and the river could be heard distantly, if you were listening. She was listening. She was not sure if he was aware of it, the sound, or if the river for him was something he knew only from maps and the movement of light on water. She thought about asking. She thought she might, eventually. After a while, he picked up a slate. "I should have found another way. Other than your father. I knew what he was. I used him anyway." She read the words. She thought about her father in the back room of the print shop, his hand steady when it should have shaken. She thought about the compositor's proof filed under Alderthorpe, index card in her own handwriting, tucked between a surveyor's notice and an inheritance filing she had never had reason to pull. She picked up the chalk. You needed someone who had already read the report, someone with nothing left to lose. I fit both criteria. She paused. Then she added, "It was still not right to involve my father." "No, but I came here anyway." She did not explain what she meant. She thought he understood it. He sat for a long time looking at the slate, and then he wrote, "I would like to earn what I did not properly ask for." Miriam looked at the words and felt the thing in her chest that had been sitting without a name since the night in the library over the maps settle, slightly, into a shape she could begin to recognize. "Then we will start there," she wrote back. They were still in the room when the lamp burned down. He lit another from the fire and came back to the chair and did not sit quite as far away as he had before, and Miriam did not move to compensate, and neither of them mentioned it. In the weeks that followed, the county court unsealed the deposition. Privat filed a formal challenge to the forged prior agreement and submitted evidence of the date alteration to the registrar. The magistrate, not her father, who had been quietly asked to recuse himself, ordered an inquiry. The physician who had attended Leighton at the time of his injury was called to testify a second time, and his original notes, which had survived in the county medical record, described injuries inconsistent with illness and consistent with blunt trauma to the temporal region. Her father was asked to attend the inquiry. He went. He sat before the county board and answered every question in a voice that did not shake, because that was how her father's voice worked, even when it should not have been steady. And he named Fen Alderthorpe's solicitor as the man who had instructed him to seal the file, and he named the date, and the board wrote it all down. He was removed from the magistracy. He was not imprisoned. At Miriam's request, and it cost her something, the request, the particular cost of choosing mercy for a man who had not chosen it for her, he was permitted to retire to the family's original property in the valley, a cottage that had been rented out for 11 years and could be rented no longer because the tenant had left it in the spring. It was more than he had earned. She knew it. He knew it too, she thought, though he did not say so. Fen Alderthorpe's legal challenge was dismissed in the 3rd week of November. The forged agreement was entered into evidence against him. The criminal matter of the assault was referred to the county court for a separate proceeding, and there Galt, the groundskeeper, appeared and said what he had seen with the plain and careful directness of a man who had been waiting 2.5 years for someone to ask him to say it in a room where it would be written down. The autumn assembly at Carrick Hall fell on the last Friday of November. Leighton had not attended a public assembly in 3 years. He came because Miriam came. She did not ask him to. He simply appeared at the door of the south sitting room that evening in formal dress, his dark coat pressed, and his posture carrying the particular steadiness that she had come to understand was not coldness at all, but the gathered composure of a man who was very aware of how much he was expending to stand in a room full of sound he could not hear. He offered her his arm. She took it. The hall was bright and full of people, and the noise, she was aware, was something he moved through rather than in. She kept herself angled slightly toward him. She learned that evening how to position herself so that he could see her face clearly and read what she needed to say in a room where carrying a slate was impractical. He learned how to check the mirror panel near the west door without appearing to. They navigated it together with the quiet coordination of people who had spent 3 weeks learning each other's methods at close range, and it was noticed by exactly one person, who was seated near the fireplace with a glass of wine, and the air of someone who had already known how this would go. Lady Vane, watching them cross the room together, looked as though a column of figures she had been running for some time had finally come out correct. Fenn was not there. He had sent a letter of apology to the county board, which Privat described as adequate, meaning that it would serve its legal function and no one would pretend it was sincere. The solicitor had withdrawn from the county. The physician had submitted a written amendment to his original assessment of Leighton's competency, which contained more careful language than regret, but gestured in that direction. The families in the room, the Renshaws and the Colberts and the others, whose names she had seen on county filings and broadsheet notices since she was a girl, watched Leighton Alderthorpe move through their assembly without a slate, without a land agent, without the intermediary of any kind, and the expressions on their faces were the expressions of people revising an understanding they had held for 3 years. Not surprise, something closer to recognition, and Miriam stood beside her husband in the bright, noisy room and felt the ground under her feet hold steady in a way it had not done in the entire 23 years she had spent above a print shop on Hartmore Street. The carriage ride home was dark and quiet. The lamp swung on its hook. The valley was cold, and the first frost had come down on the fields while they were inside, and the world outside the carriage windows was very still and silver. She had been watching it when she felt him write. He had taken the small card from his jacket and written without looking down, the way he wrote when the words were already in order, and he held it out toward her. "I married you because the situation required it. I am asking now because I would like you to stay, not for the case, or the court, or any document in any file, because since you arrived I have not been alone with any of this, and I had forgotten what that was like." She took the card and read it. She turned it over, as she always did. "I have been staying since the night you left the maps out on the library table, and assumed I could read a survey." She saw him read it. She saw what happened to his face. He reached across the space between them, and took her hand and held it, and the grip was not precise or measured. It was simply his hand and hers, and the carriage carried them north along the river road toward Alderthorpe House, where the lamps would be lit in the entrance hall, and Mrs. Hatch would have left tea on the south sitting-room table, because she was the kind of person who thought 12 steps ahead of the moment and never mentioned it. 14 months later, the house was different in ways that were both large and small. The mirror panels were still on the corridor walls because they were useful, and because Leighton had spent 3 years thinking carefully about how to live well in the space available to him, and there was no reason to abandon a good solution, just because the context around it had changed. But the south sitting room and the library had somewhere along the way ceased to be separate working spaces and become one continuous room in practice, their papers interleaved, her surveying notes stacked beside his estate correspondence, the chalk dust on the slates belonging equally to both of them. Miriam sat at the library desk one afternoon in January, going through Privat's most recent case summary, when the door opened and Leighton came in with a small person arranged in the crook of his arm with the focused care of a man who had taken this responsibility extremely seriously from the first hour and had not yet relaxed about it. The child was 4 months old and had her father's dark hair and what appeared to be her mother's habit of examining everything put in front of her with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance. Leighton settled into the chair beside the desk, which was where he sat now, close enough that no relay was necessary between them. He held out the child toward the window, where the January light was coming in clean and cold, and the child looked at the light with the intent concentration of a person encountering something for the first time and reserving judgment. Lady Vane arrived at noon, as she did every second week, with shortbread and opinions. She kissed the baby and critiqued the light in the east parlour, and sat down with Leighton with the satisfied expression of someone who has been right for a long time and is enjoying the confirmation. She said something to him. She had learned, over the past year, to face him squarely and speak clearly, which she did with the same precision she brought to everything, and he wrote his response on the card in his jacket pocket and handed it to her, and Lady Vane read it, and produced an expression that was as close to delighted as her face permitted. Miriam looked at them from across the room and pressed her hand to her sternum where the feeling lived, the one that still surprised her with its presence. That afternoon a letter arrived from Privat. The formal hearing date for the criminal matter against Fen Alderthorpe had been set for the spring term. Privat would require the Baroness of Alderthorpe's testimony regarding the deposition and her father's account records. He had enclosed a secondary note marked for her eyes alone. She read it twice. During the preparation of the case, a second document had surfaced in the solicitor's files from the Alderthorpe estate. A letter predating the assault by 6 months, in a hand that was neither Fen's nor his solicitor's. Someone else had been advising him. Someone who had known the plan before it was carried out. Someone who had not yet been named. Miriam set the letter on the desk and looked through the library window at her husband, who was pointing out the winter sparrows to their daughter, with an earnestness that made Miriam's throat tighten in the very best way. He felt her looking. He always did now. He turned, and his eyes found hers across the room with the easy certainty of a man who knows exactly where to look, and she held up the letter so he could see it from where he sat. His expression said, "More work." She picked up the chalk. There was always more work. She had found, this past year, that she did not mind.